Hello, everybody. My name is Daniel Ehrlich, and I'm from the European Commission. So today, my talk is about global exposure maps. The exposure I'm referring to is the one you see on this screen. Exposure is the buildings and the people living in it. Why we are doing global exposure maps? Mostly for global risk models and for global early warning models. For those, you need both exposure, which you see here, and also the hazard, which is the simulated wave here, the blue simulated tsunami wave on this community. But why I'm telling you that we need global exposure maps? Because we feel we do not have the global exposure maps. So this is on a community in the Philippines, it's Legazpi, and now I'm showing you what's available globally for this area. So is this area here, which is, this is an area covering about 10 by 5 kilometers, and every small square there is 500 meters. So for this area on global exposure maps, you see only very little. But those maps are great because globally, you see where the big cities are and so on and so on. But for really risk models and early warning models, it's not sufficient. These data sets capture maybe 20% of the global exposure, no more, maybe 30%, no more than that. So what is the rest? So for that, we would need to have maps like the ones you see in this here. It's the same area, but produced at very finer scale. Now, why you feel we need that detail for exposure? Because when an event strikes, you have to know, for example, a village, how far it is from a volcano, how far from a fault line, or how many buildings you have in a floodplain, or what is the size of a coastal community that may be affected by a tsunami wave. So for doing that, you need the detail, and that we do not have. For tsunami, for those applications, 1 kilometer apart, or even sometimes 100 meters apart, makes all the difference between having a total destruction and no destruction at all. So when I tell this to my children, they tell me, but Dad, don't you work with satellite imagery? Of course we work with satellite imagery, and there are lots of satellite imagery available there. You have archives, and probably some of you know them, and it takes probably a lifetime to go through all of those archives, but maybe the information are not there. Mostly those archives contain information that provide maps like this, not maps like this. But there is a good news, and the good news is that we do have now satellite imagery that provide information, very detailed information. This is a collection of images taken over many cities. Each square is 300 by 300 meters. For many, and what is so interesting about those images is that you can identify houses, you can size them, you can measure also how vulnerable they are, and you can tell how one city differs from another and how the one is more vulnerable from the others. It's great. We even have them on Google Earth. You can all look them on Google Earth on a similar image browser. But then if all the information is there, why don't we have exposure maps globally? Well, the reason is that this information here, this satellite imagery, are costly. And if you want to do something with this imagery, probably you have to have a computer, you have to have people that add value, that create a maps, that extract a map. And this is costly. So what happens is that most affluent communities, most big cities, do have exposure maps. But the smaller ones, maybe the ones that are most exposed to risk, do not have maps. So it's difficult to quantify risk for those areas. I have the privilege to work on a global exposure database within the global earthquake model, and I experienced how difficult it is to get fine-scale exposure maps that I'm addressing here. And some of the latest report, including the CIREX report and so on, point out that most of the risk is not in the big city that are affluent enough to have these risk reduction measures. It's in the areas in between cities, those where the illegal settlements maybe spring up or informal settlements spring up. Those are the most likely. And for those areas, we do not have risk maps. So what to do? Well, I have good news is that if you go and try to, for example, Google Earth, to identify all the exposure, count buildings, and create exposure maps for the entire world manually, is really, I believe, almost an impossible task. Would take ages, and then you would need an army of an analyst to do that. And how do you coordinate all of this? Fortunately, we have scientists, and scientists have developed algorithms to process satellite imagery. And from the process satellite imagery, you can derive maps like this. So settlement maps that can be used for exposure. So I want to tell you that some of these scientists have, for example, collected all the satellite imagery they could get a hold on to make an experiment to try if it works, and over China, Brazil, Europe, and they have to come together and they tested and processed satellite imagery and derived exposure maps like this one for about 20% of the land surfaces of the globe. And the amazing thing is that it worked. So not only it works and produced maps like that, but if they would have had satellite imagery for the entire globe, they would have processed the entire globe, entire land masses. That was the first good thing. And the second good thing is that from these experiments, we have learned that there are settlements that were unknown to us. Of course, you identify the big cities, London, Hamburg, and so on. But there are other patterns, other settlements, for example, this one's here, that nobody knew existed. Or if you go here, this is China. We would never have known that there are settlement patterns like this that are probably in the floodplains that could be at risk. Or you have in even affluent society, like, or you have, this is Brazil, you have Italy. There are patterns that are really unheard of. So this was a learning experience. But so the technology says that why don't we have exposure maps globally? Well, I don't think we can blame the satellite image providers. We cannot blame the scientists. We cannot blame anybody. But I think if we could get the satellite image providers to provide us with some of the satellite imagery, for example, old archived imagery of the quality that I showed you before, if we could get the donors to provide a minimum amount of funding for processing this satellite imagery, if we could get the scientists to provide the algorithms to process the imagery, and probably civil society, ISDR, whoever, to lobby to get things working, then we could have a global exposure map to run our risk models. Now it is about 8 years since Hyogo, and one of the important things that Hyogo highlighted was to identify, assess, and monitor disaster risk. I do not know if we are able to do it at the global level. Probably you know better than me. But there is certainly one thing is that, as they say in business, if we cannot measure, we cannot manage. And if we cannot measure exposure, which is one of the parameters of risk, we cannot assess and monitor our risks. Now, it was important for me to tell you now that the technology is there, the data are there, and exposure maps at the fine scales for running accurate early warning models and disaster risk models are available. I believe it can be done with the help of everybody, with the help of some, of this community, and I hope you agree with me that it can be done. Thank you very much.